On the 30th of June 1956, a passenger flight departed Los Angeles bound for Kansas City. Minutes later, another aircraft took off from Los Angeles bound for Chicago. Neither plane would reach its destination. Instead, both would end up in the Grand Canyon, having been involved in the first commercial aviation accident to cost more than 100 people their lives. In the 1950s, travelling by plane was a somewhat exclusive experience. The cost of travel meant that not everyone could afford to fly, and those who did were often treated to a luxurious journey. On board aircraft, you might find specially designed sleeping berths, fully stocked bars, cigarettes for sale to be smoked during the flight, and comfortable seats complete with tables off which passengers would eat pre-prepared gourmet meals. Air travel was a growing industry, with different airlines vying to offer the best experience and persuade more people to fly rather than use ground-based transport. Because of this, service on planes in the 1950s was a priority. In contrast with the sophisticated customer service, air traffic control was relatively basic. Radar had been developed during the war, but was not yet used to track commercial flights. Instead, pilots navigated using their instruments and relayed their position regularly to their own company's air traffic controllers. These controllers kept track of planes using a system of paper tokens, physical maps, and tables. Controllers from different airlines would sometimes share relevant information with one another, but were not required to do so by law. Flights would be most carefully managed when in controlled airspace. For example, when above a city or near an airport. When away from these busy areas, however, pilots would, weather permitting, often be allowed to fly under visual flight rules. That is to say, with the pilots taking responsibility for observing their surroundings and avoiding conflict with nearby flights. This allowed pilots freedom to make small alterations to their course. They might, for example, detour around adverse weather, or even make a slight change in heading to afford passengers a better view. On the 30th of June 1956, a Transworld Airlines, or TWA, Lockheed L1049A Super Constellation took off from Los Angeles Airport at 9:01 a.m., bound for Kansas City Downtown Airport. There were 70 people on board, 64 passengers and 6 members of crew. Just a few minutes later, another flight departed Los Angeles Airport. This time, it was a United Airlines Douglas DC-7 with 58 people on board, 53 passengers and 5 crew. It was headed for Chicago's Midway Airport and got airborne at 9:04 a.m. Both flights would, for the initial part of their journey, be flying broadly in the same direction across the country. The pilots of both flights independently chose to make slight alterations to their courses to pass directly over the Grand Canyon and offer their passengers some spectacular views as they did so. Both flights would reach a particular waypoint, the Painted Desert Line, at around the same time. At the controls of the TWA flight was Captain Jack Gandy, a 41-year-old man with almost 15,000 flight hours to his name. Shortly after takeoff, Captain Gandy requested permission to ascend to 6,400 meters, or 21,000 feet, in order to avoid a bank of cloud. His request was denied, as the United Airlines flight was nearby and already at that altitude. Captain Gandy still wanted to avoid the clouds ahead, and so he requested permission to go 1,000 on top, meaning that he would take the plane up until it was at least 300 meters or 1,000 feet above any cloud and switch to visual flight rules, thus assuming responsibility for watching for other air traffic around him. Air traffic controllers approved this request and advised him to watch out for the United Airlines flight, which would be in his general vicinity. Captain Gandy could have taken the TWA flight up to any altitude more than 300 meters or 1,000 feet above the cloud. Unfortunately, he selected an altitude of 6,400 meters or 21,000 feet, the same altitude as that of the United Airlines flight. At around 10:30 a.m., as the two flights were both maneuvering around cloud at the same altitude, they collided. Despite the United Airlines flight making a last-second attempt to avoid impact by pitching down and to the right, the collision was catastrophic. The tail of the TWA superconstellation was severed in the crash, sending the plane into a rapid nosedive. It slammed into a ravine on the northeast slope of Temple Butte in the Grand Canyon and disintegrated, killing everyone on board. A fire swiftly consumed the wreckage. Meanwhile, the United Airlines Douglas DC-7 suffered severe damage to one wing and one engine, sending it into an irretrievable downward spiral. It impacted the south face of Schwa Butte at high speed, resulting in the instant death of everyone on board. Again, the impact caused the plane to disintegrate, and fire tore through the wreckage that remained. In the absence of radar, it was not immediately apparent to air traffic controllers what had happened to the two aircraft. It was concerning that neither had checked in when they should have done at 10:31 a.m. as they crossed the Painted Desert line, but it was not a cause for alarm until some time had passed. At 11:51 a.m., a notice was issued advising that the planes were missing and asking all pilots in the area to report anything unusual. One pair of pilots did. Henry and Palin Hudgen ran Grand Canyon Airlines, a sightseeing air tour service. Palin had seen a plume of black smoke near Temple Butte earlier in the day, but had assumed it was merely a small brush fire. Now aware that two commercial airliners were missing, he and his brother took a second look, and soon spotted the distinctive three-pronged tail of the TWA flight in a ravine, as well as the wreckage of the United Airlines flight on a ledge halfway up a sheer cliff face. Once it was established that the aircraft had crashed and the location of the main crash sites, rescuers were dispatched by helicopter. They were able to access the remains of the TWA flight and quickly concluded that there were no survivors. Reaching the remains of the United Airlines flight where it was perched on a ledge midway up the wall of Schwa Butte was considerably more difficult. Assistance was given by the Denver Rocky Mountain Rescue Club, and later by a group of expert Swiss mountaineers. They were hired to retrieve both vital evidence and any human remains that could possibly be identified. Determining the cause of the crash was an extremely difficult process. At the time, cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders were not used. It was only by examining the damage to the wreckage that investigators could piece together the sequence of events. Paint from each aircraft was found on the wreckage of the other. This, combined with an examination of recorded communications from the pilots, allowed investigators to assemble a chain of events. Both flights had deviated from their planned courses, most likely to offer passengers a view of the Grand Canyon. The TWA flight had been cleared to ascend under visual flight rules to the same altitude as the United Airlines flight, and had done so even though visibility, and thus the pilot's ability to see other traffic, was reduced by cloud. When the planes came within sight of one another through that cloud, it was too late to react, and a catastrophic collision had been the result. News of the accident, including its cause, was broadcast around the world. The American public reacted with shock to the findings of the investigation. The way in which air traffic control was carried out was criticized as primitive and chaotic. Significant changes were demanded by a public that, having started to enjoy the benefits of air travel, wanted to know that it was safe. As a direct result of the crash, air traffic controllers across the country were retrained, and many new controllers were hired. Working practices were modernized, most notably by the incorporation of radar, previously an exclusively military technology. After several more accidents and near misses, the Federal Aviation Administration was formed, a centralized organization responsible for the control of all air traffic in the United States. Since its formation, collisions between planes in flight have become increasingly rare. Though some attempt was made to remove human remains and wreckage from the crash sites by helicopter, it was difficult and dangerous work. So difficult and dangerous, in fact, that it was left incomplete for many years. From 1956 until 1976, wreckage and human remains were abandoned at the two crash sites, prompting a small number of curious people to hike out in order to visit these areas. Some visitors may even have taken items from the crash sites during this time. In 1976, at the insistence of National Park Service officials, the airlines paid for the removal of the majority of the remaining debris by helicopter. Any small items that remained became officially protected by the Federal Antiquities Act in 2006, before the whole area was designated a National Historical Landmark in 2014. A plaque in a publicly accessible area close to the site informs visitors of its significance. It reads, "This tragic accident site represents a watershed moment in the modernization of America's airways."